He laughed while divorcing her until she collapsed in front of the judge who secretly loved her. Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories, where love rises from the ashes and every ending leaves a mark on the soul. I'm your storyteller, James, and tonight, you're not just hearing a story, you're feeling it. But first, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments, because this is for you. Tonight's chapter is quiet, but it carries the kind of moment that can change everything. A cry breaks the silence, a name is whispered with tears, and someone who was once forgotten finally becomes unforgettable. That's all I'll say for now. But if your heart has ever been broken or healed by love, subscribe to this channel, not just for stories, but for truth wrapped in love, for the moments we hide and the ones we live for. Now take a breath, hold it, and come with me. This ending might just rewrite everything. Let's start. Senorita stood still in the dimly lit kitchen, her fingers clutching the edge of the marble countertop as if it were the only thing holding her upright. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, not just with the scent of cinnamon tea she had just brewed for him, but with something darker, something like the end of hope. She had waited for him to come home all day, wearing his favorite lavender dress and soft perfume he once said reminded him of spring evenings. Her heart fluttered with quiet nerves and misplaced affection. But what she received instead of warmth was a hurricane of cruelty that shattered her in an instant. Mr. Rachel had barely stepped inside before his eyes pierced her, colder than the winter wind that rattled the window panes. "Say," she whispered, praying she'd misheard him, praying it was some kind of cruel joke, but his expression didn't falter. It was like looking at stone. "Don't make this dramatic, senorita. It's simple. I want out. You can't give me a child, and frankly, I'm tired of pretending this marriage still means something." Each syllable was a dagger. She felt them carve into her chest, twisting where she thought love had lived. Her hands slowly let go of the counter, her fingers pale from gripping too hard. I thought we were trying. You said we'd keep trying," she said with a cracked voice, her breath catching between every syllable. "You said you loved me." He scoffed, a dry, cold laugh that echoed too loudly in the silent kitchen. "Love? That was a long time ago. I need a legacy, a name to carry forward, not a woman who cries over test results and begs the stars for a miracle that isn't coming." His words weren't just cruel, they were venomous, born from a heart that no longer cared. She took a step back as if trying to physically distance herself from the pain. Her vision blurred, but she didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. Inside her chest, her heart was breaking, piece by piece, quietly, without spectacle. "So that's all I am to you?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "A womb? A means to an end?" He walked past her, grabbing the tea she had made and dumping it into the sink like it was garbage. "Don't make this about your feelings," he said carelessly. "It's about practicality. I've wasted enough time on this dead-end relationship. I've spoken to my lawyer. The papers are ready." Her world was shattering beneath her feet, yet she stood tall, barely. "You didn't even tell me. You didn't even talk to me before deciding this," she asked, each word shaking. "You just, what? Made a decision and erased me from your life?" Mr. Rachel turned finally, his eyes meeting hers for the first time all night, and the cruelty in them was unbearable. "I didn't need to talk. There's nothing left to say. You're broken, senorita, and I'm not going to waste another second pretending I don't see it." She flinched like she had been slapped, but her voice remained steady, even as her soul fractured. "And all this time, all these nights, I waited for you, prayed with you, cried in silence, hoping we'd make it through." Her voice faltered and her eyes filled with the tears she had tried so hard to hide. "It meant nothing to you?" He looked at her as if bored. "Honestly, I barely noticed. Her hands trembled as he pulled a folder from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. "Sign these. The faster we end this, the faster we can both move on." She looked down at the papers, unable to breathe. Every line, every paragraph, was a nail in the coffin of the love she thought they had. Her fingers hovered over the folder, but she couldn't move. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her throat felt like it was closing. "Why now?" she asked, still searching for some humanity in him, some trace of the man she once loved. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, as if this moment meant nothing. "Because I met someone else," he said simply. "She's younger, and she can give me what you can't. I'm not going to waste more years waiting for a miracle that won't come." The silence that followed was unbearable. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed deafening. Señorita felt her soul collapse under the weight of his indifference. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but she stood still, paralyzed by grief and disbelief. With trembling fingers, she opened the folder, stared at her own name typed in cold, legal print, and picked up the pen that rested beside it. Her signature felt like a death sentence. She signed once, then again, and then pressed the final mark that would end 5 years of marriage. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, but she didn't look at him. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she closed the folder, her heart was so heavy it was a wonder she was still breathing. "I hope she gives you what you're looking for," she said quietly, her voice broken but steady. "And I hope one day you feel what it's like to be discarded like a used object." He didn't respond. He just smirked, took the folder, and walked out of the kitchen like he was walking out of a business meeting. She heard the front door open and close. Just like that, it was over. No apologies, no second thoughts, no backward glance. Just silence. She stood there long after he had gone, unmoving, as if she could still hear the echo of his words bouncing off the walls. "You're broken. You're useless. You're infertile." Over and over again, like a cruel mantra. Her body felt like lead. Her legs gave way and she sank slowly to the floor, her back against the cold cabinet door. Still, she did not cry. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. She stared blankly ahead into nothing. Her breath came in shallow waves, and her chest ached so deeply it felt like her ribs were caving in. She wrapped her arms around her knees, curling into herself like a child trying to disappear. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The clock ticked on, and the kitchen darkened as the sun disappeared behind thick clouds outside. The silence was suffocating. She thought about all the dreams she had woven in this house, how she used to imagine tiny footsteps running across this very floor, little laughter echoing in these rooms. She had clung to hope with all her might, believing love could conquer even biology. But now all that remained was emptiness, betrayal, the realization that he never truly saw her. He only saw what she could offer, and when that offering failed, he discarded her like an expired contract. Yet, even through the pain, a tiny ember inside her refused to die. It didn't burn with rage or bitterness. It was something quieter, something stronger, the last flicker of dignity. She slowly stood up, steadying herself against the counter. Her body ached, her heart bled, but she didn't collapse. Not tonight. She moved like a ghost through the house, her hands touching the walls one last time, breathing in the memories she had once built with so much love. In her bedroom, she packed a small suitcase, just the essentials. Not because she wanted to leave, but because staying meant dying a slow death of humiliation and despair. She didn't leave a note. She didn't call a friend. She didn't scream. She simply walked out of the door, one step at a time, as if each footfall was reclaiming a piece of herself. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the city lights blinked in the distance, unaware of her heartbreak. She looked back at the house one last time, not with longing, but with finality. She had no idea where she would go or what tomorrow would bring. But somewhere deep in her aching chest, a new kind of hope stirred, silent, unseen, but alive. Maybe this was not the end. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something else, something stronger, something beautiful. And with that fragile thought, she stepped into the unknown, unaware that destiny had already turned its gaze toward her. The courthouse loomed in front of her like a monument to every broken vow she had ever believed in. Cold stone, sharp edges, and echoing halls filled with whispers of stories just like hers. Senorita stood at the steps, clutching a simple file against her chest, the very document that would strip her of the title of wife in the eyes of the law. The morning was cloudy, the sky heavy with the kind of gray that pressed against your soul, and yet she walked with composure, dressed in a modest black dress and low heels, her face bare of makeup, her hair pinned up as if she were attending a funeral, because for her it was. She didn't glance around the plaza or pause to steady her breath. Her movements were slow, each step more deliberate than the last, as if trying not to shatter before she even reached the courtroom door. Her fingers trembled around the folder, and though she walked with her head high, her spirit dragged behind her like a torn veil. Inside, the courtroom was cold in both temperature and tone. Walls of pale oak, polished benches, and an eerie silence that settled once she stepped inside. On one side, Rachel sat like a king on a throne of arrogance, his suit perfect, his smirk already present, fingers tapping the wood as if he were bored by the legalities of it all. His lawyer whispered something to him, and he chuckled, not once looking towards Senorita as she took her seat across the room. The smell of paper, old books, and coffee filled the air, but all Senorita could feel was the metallic taste of heartbreak resting on her tongue. The judge hadn't entered yet, and the murmur of low conversations buzzed like a swarm of bees in her ears. She stared at the pen that lay before her, beside the final page of their dissolution document, as if it were a sword meant to cut away the last tether between them. She didn't flinch when the clerk called the session to order. The doors opened, and in stepped the judge, tall, poised, with a face carved in solemn authority. His black robe flowed as he approached the bench, but the moment he glanced at Senorita, something strange flickered across his eyes. She didn't notice. Her gaze was anchored downward, her shoulders still. The proceedings began, cold, factual, clinical. Rachel's lawyer spoke first, laying out the case with mechanical precision, like dismantling a business merger rather than ending a love story. Senorita didn't respond. Her own lawyer echoed the terms she had agreed to with numbed silence. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply shook her head. Not because she had no words, but because none would matter. Her voice would not change the outcome. It was already written in the ink that stained her file. When the judge asked them both to sign, Rachel picked up the pen like it was a trophy. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name with flair, then leaned back with a satisfied smile, glancing at Senorita like a man who believed he had just won something grand. His grin was arrogant, venomous, a smirk that would haunt her later in dreams she'd try to forget. And then it was her turn. Her hand reached slowly for the pen, but her fingers froze just above it. Her body had gone rigid, her vision narrowing. Her chest rose and fell, and it felt like her lungs couldn't pull in enough air. Still, she forced herself to pick up the pen, though it felt 10 times heavier than it should. Her name flowed onto the paper, barely legible, shaky, but complete. It was done, just like that. Years of love, pain, sacrifice, and silent prayers, all reduced to a signature. The moment the judge confirmed the dissolution, Rachel let out a breathless laugh. Not loud, not obnoxious, but a quiet chuckle filled with smug satisfaction. He even adjusted his cufflinks, looking too pleased with himself. That laugh, it tore something deep inside Senorita. Not because it was cruel, but because it made her feel foolish for having ever loved him. That sound, the gloating exhale of a man who had discarded her like an expired belonging, echoed louder than any insult he had ever thrown her way. Her eyes lifted just slightly, meeting his for the briefest moment. He looked so triumphant. She looked so lost. And that tiny, fragile string that had been holding her up since she stepped inside? It finally snapped. Her heart gave out before her body did. First came the wave of dizziness, a rush of blood draining from her head, the sound of the room warping like it was underwater. Her vision blurred and everything tilted. The pen dropped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft clink that sounded like thunder in her ears. Then, without a word, without a scream, her knees buckled beneath her. The courtroom gasped as she collapsed, her body folding in slow motion to the floor, her head hitting the marble with a sickening thud. Papers scattered, whispers turned into shouts, and people stood. The bailiff rushed forward, calling her name, but she was already gone from consciousness. Her body lay still, fragile against the hard ground, her black dress fanned around her like wilting petals. Her face was pale, her lips parted, her lashes trembling, but finally tears spilled down the side of her cheek, rolling silently as if her soul had decided to grieve now that her body had given out. The entire room was stunned, but no one was more visibly shaken than Judge John. The gavel fell from his hand, hitting the bench with a loud, accidental bang. He stood, not like a judge, but like a man watching the woman he couldn't bear to see in pain. His face went pale, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on her as if nothing else in that courtroom existed. "Call a medic! Now!" the bailiff shouted, already kneeling beside her, checking her pulse, gently lifting her shoulders. Rachel stood at a distance, arms crossed, confused, but not concerned, like her collapse was merely an inconvenience in his schedule. Senorita's breath was shallow. Her face was soft, peaceful, as if finally asleep after months of torment. And all the while, Judge John kept staring, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his bench, something unreadable swirling behind his eyes, something sharp, something desperate. He should have remained seated, should have kept his position of authority, but his body moved before his mind could stop it. He stepped down from the bench, descending like a man abandoning law, and stepping into something painfully personal. Every eye in the room followed him, but he didn't notice. He approached the scene with controlled urgency, kneeling beside her as the paramedics arrived, brushing the hair from her face with a touch too tender for a man who was supposed to be impartial. "Is she breathing?" he asked softly, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. The medic nodded. "She fainted. Stress. Blood pressure crash. We're stabilizing her now." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Rachel raised a brow, watching the judge with sudden curiosity, but John ignored him. His eyes remained on Senorita, taking in every line of her face, memorizing the way her lashes rested against her cheeks, the soft rise and fall of her chest as life slowly returned to her. And when her lips parted, just slightly, as if dreaming something far away, he exhaled as though something in him had been held captive and was finally let go. In that moment, something irreversible began. No one understood it yet. No one noticed the tremor in John's fingers or the way he looked at her like she was the only soul that had ever existed in that sterile room. And though her eyes were still closed and her mind lost in shadows, something in the air shifted. A quiet, unnamed gravity pulled him toward her, not as a judge, not as a man of law, but as someone whose own heart had cracked open in silent empathy. He hadn't known her name until today. He hadn't planned to care. But the way she collapsed, the grief written in her silence, the elegance of her pain, the dignity she held until her very body betrayed her, it shook something inside him that had long been buried under robes and rules and order. They carried her out gently, her head resting against soft padding, IV connected, oxygen mask in place. The gurney wheels squeaked across the polished floor as the courtroom watched in silence. Rachel turned away, already dialing a number, uninterested. But John stood frozen by the bench, his heart still racing, the echo of her fall replaying in his ears like a scream. Outside, the ambulance blinked in red, and rain had begun to fall. Not violently, but gently, as if even the sky were mourning. As the doors closed behind her, the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a mix of lavender and heartbreak. And somewhere deep in Judge John's chest, something whispered, "You were meant to notice her." He just didn't know yet how true that would become. The last flicker of red from the ambulance lights vanished behind the heavy courthouse doors, swallowed by the gray curtain of rain as the paramedics disappeared into the world outside, taking Señorita with them. Inside the courtroom, silence returned, but it was no longer the cold, indifferent quiet of legal procedure. It was the stunned hush of spectators who had witnessed something far deeper than a divorce. And still Judge John stood there at the foot of his bench, unmoving, his fingers curled around the edge of the wooden dais, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising with short, shallow gasps that betrayed the tightness in his throat. No one dared speak. Not the lawyers, not the clerks, not even Rachel, who had paused mid-call just to glance again at the man whose composed facade had cracked before their very eyes. But John didn't notice them. Not anymore. The courtroom, the walls, the laws, none of it mattered now. All he could see was her, Señorita, unconscious, pale and trembling as they wheeled her away, the sound of the gurney wheels still echoing in his ears. He had stood behind that bench for 100 trials, passed verdicts on lives without flinching. Yet today he had broken all protocol, all rules, and all boundaries the moment she collapsed. And not because she was another woman in distress, but because she was her, the girl he never forgot, the memory he had buried beneath decades of dignity, law degrees, and black robes. She was the very first heartbreak that never bloomed, and now she was the reason his heart beat like it was chasing time. He moved, suddenly, not like a judge, like a man no longer able to deny what had lived in silence for years. He rushed out of the courtroom, removing the robe as he walked, his shoes echoing urgently down the marble hallway. His assistant called after him, but he didn't stop. Rain pelted the front steps as he exited, his shirt clinging to him within seconds. But he kept going. Across the courthouse plaza, down the wet pavement, where the flashing lights of the ambulance still glowed dimly through mist. "Wait!" he shouted, voice hoarse, as the back doors prepared to close. One of the medics turned, surprised, but John was already at the door, his hand catching it just before it sealed. His breath hitched when he saw her again, her face still colorless, oxygen mask soft against her skin, one hand lying beside her, open, vulnerable. "Who are you, sir?" the medic asked cautiously. John hesitated for a heartbeat, then answered honestly, quietly. "I'm someone who should have held her hand years ago. Let me ride with her, please." There was something in his tone, in the rawness of his voice, that melted past protocol. The medic nodded once, sliding aside to let him in. John climbed in, took the seat beside her, and without thinking, gently reached for her hand. His fingers wrapped around hers slowly, reverently, like he was touching a sacred memory. Her skin was cold, soft, and still trembling faintly. He squeezed gently, whispering her name under his breath as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the siren wailed into life. His mind spiraled as they sped through rain-slicked streets. And in that darkened space, lit only by pulsing red and blue reflections, the weight of years unraveled within him. He remembered her. God, he remembered everything. College library, third floor, corner table near the windows, where she sat every Friday at 5 p.m., reading novels in quiet bliss, a sunflower bookmark peeking from the pages. He had watched her from a distance then, too timid to speak, too consumed with his studies and future to make space for risk. But every time she laughed at a line in a book or tucked her hair behind her ear, it felt like something inside him stirred. She was soft-spoken, graceful, radiant in a way that didn't ask for attention but deserved all of it. He had memorized the way she scribbled notes in the margins, the way she carried her bag with the strap slipping off her shoulder, the way she once offered him a pen when his ran dry during midterms. A tiny kindness, a moment forgotten by everyone, except him. He never told her. Not when they both graduated. Not even when he saw her name years later in a local newspaper under the wedding section. Señorita, marrying someone else. Rachel. That name had stuck in his mind like a needle, and he had cursed himself for not being brave, for not speaking when he had the chance. But he buried those regrets beneath career ambitions, robe collars, and courtroom dignity. Until now. Now, that girl from the library, the woman who married someone else, was lying beside him in an ambulance, her heart broken, her world collapsed, and the silent guilt inside him roared louder than the sirens. He didn't let go of her hand the entire ride. The medics worked quietly, monitoring vitals, adjusting IVs. She stirred once, barely, her brows furrowed slightly, and her fingers twitched. He leaned closer, breath catching. "Señorita," he whispered, voice trembling, "you don't deserve this. Not this pain, not this heartbreak." The way he said her name was not just filled with familiarity, it was filled with years of longing, years of silence. He knew she couldn't hear him, but he needed to say it, needed to speak aloud all the words he had buried. You were always meant to be loved gently, not discarded like something broken. At the hospital, he refused to leave her side. When they wheeled her in, he walked alongside the stretcher, drenched but determined, answering questions the doctors asked, even signing temporary guardian approval forms when they hesitated. "I'll be responsible. I won't leave her alone," he said firmly. And though the nurses raised eyebrows, they nodded, swayed by the intensity in his voice and the obvious torment in his eyes. They settled her into a private room, the lights dimmed, a monitor softly beeping beside her. He stood by the bed, still holding her hand, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead as though it were instinct. He sat beside her in the chair and watched her breathe. Every rise and fall of her chest, a tiny miracle that she had survived everything thrown at her. The night deepened. Nurses came and went. Papers were signed. Rachel never showed up. No calls. No concern. And John knew then, without a shadow of doubt, that the man who had once married her had never truly seen her. But he had, all those years ago in that quiet corner of the library, and now with her lying before him, wounded, fragile, yet unimaginably brave, he saw her more clearly than ever. And with each passing second a vow formed inside him, wordless but ironclad. He would never walk away again. He would never let her fall alone again. If fate had brought her back into his life like this, then it was no accident. And if she would let him, someday, somehow, he would help her rebuild. When morning light finally pierced through the blinds and bathed her face in soft gold, she stirred slightly, her lips parting as if she were waking from a long, painful dream. He rose from the chair instantly, heart pounding. Her lashes fluttered, her eyes opened slowly, and the very first thing she saw was him. The pale, golden morning light spilled softly through the slatted blinds, warming the sterile white of the hospital walls and casting faint shadows over the smooth sheets where Señorita lay. Her lashes fluttered again, slower this time, and the blur before her eyes began to clear into shapes, colors, then presence, a presence that felt both foreign and inexplicably safe. She blinked once more, her chest rising with a tentative breath, and that was when she saw him. John. He was sitting quietly beside her bed, slightly slouched in the visitor's chair, but alert, fully awake, with eyes that never left her face. In the morning glow, he looked nothing like the stern judge she vaguely remembered from the courtroom. No black robe, no rigid expression, only softness in his gaze and exhaustion clinging to his posture. She stared at him, her mind struggling to match the pieces, until he leaned forward just enough to tuck a strand of her hair gently behind her ear, his fingers warm against her temple. "You fainted," he said softly, his voice rich but gentle, soaked in relief. "But you're safe now, señorita. You're safe." The way he said her name, like it was more than just a name, like it was a prayer spoken after years of silence, sent a strange comfort rushing through her chest, so much so that her eyes burned with uncried tears she wasn't even aware she still carried. She looked around, realizing she was in a private hospital room, the walls decorated with soft, earthy colors, the air infused with faint lavender and gentle piano music drifting from a speaker somewhere above. "How?" she whispered, her throat dry, her voice small. "Don't worry about that," he murmured, pouring a glass of water for her and holding it carefully to her lips. "Just rest. Everything else can wait." And he meant it. He meant every single word, because John had already canceled every court appointment for the week. From the moment the hospital had admitted her, he hadn't left her side. Not for coffee, not for food, not for the comfort of sleep. He had stayed beside her, his only nourishment, being the sight of her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, and the occasional twitch of her fingers that told him she was still fighting somewhere beneath that fragile shell of silence. He'd personally spoken to the hospital administration, arranged for a private chef to prepare meals tailored for recovery, hired a professional therapist to consult for trauma without intruding, and selected music therapists who curated a healing atmosphere with calming melodies that soothed the nervous system and stabilized her pulse. The nurses, stunned, spoke in hushed admiration in the hallways. This was not just a man caring for a woman. This was something deeper, something sacred, as if he were protecting a treasure he never wanted the world to harm again. Señorita didn't know all of that yet. All she could see was him. Tired but devoted, gentle but firm, never pushing her to talk, never asking questions, just being present in a way no one had ever been for her. Throughout the day he sat with her, speaking in soft tones about the flowers outside the hospital window, about the way the rain had cleared overnight and the sky had opened into a quiet blue. He spoke not to distract her, but to remind her that life still moved gently beyond the storm she'd survived. When she grew tired, he helped her adjust her pillows, covering her with the softest blankets the hospital had. When her IV tugged at her arm uncomfortably, he called the nurse before she could even flinch. He brushed her hair back when strands clung to her cheek with sweat. He whispered to her in the soft moments before sleep. Little things, like how brave she was, how strong she'd been to survive all she had, and how proud he was that she had never allowed herself to become bitter, even when the world had done everything to break her. He didn't say these things out of pity. He said them with reverence, like someone who saw in her not just pain, but power. And for the first time in what felt like years, Señorita allowed herself to rest, truly rest, without feeling guilty, without fear creeping into the corners of her dreams. That night she fell asleep to the sound of his voice reading poetry from a book he had picked up from the hospital gift shop. And for the first time in months, there were no nightmares, no images of Rachel's cruel smirk, no echoes of infertile clawing through her brain. Just peace. Just a hand beside hers and a voice telling her she mattered. By the second morning, her appetite returned in small ways. She ate fruit slices he offered on the tip of a fork, her fingers still too shaky to hold the plate. She blushed the first time he smiled at her after she finished half her soup, and he laughed softly. Victory number 1. There was no rush, no pressure, just healing, gentle, intentional, sacred. Sometimes she'd glance at him and find him already watching her, not with desire or pity, but with awe, like he was looking at someone who had walked through fire and still managed to shine. One afternoon, when the sunlight poured in stronger and the window was open just enough to let in the warm breeze, she turned to him and asked, "Why are you doing all this for me?" He looked at her for a long moment, then stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the view for a beat before answering. "Because you once smiled at me in a library when you didn't know I existed. And I never forgot it." She blinked in surprise, but he didn't turn around. "Because I saw you love someone who didn't deserve you. And I watched it break you. Because if fate's given me this one chance to do something right by you after all these years, then I'm not going to waste it." When he finally turned back, she was looking at him not with confusion anymore, but something softer, something warmer. He came back to her side and gently took her hand again, squeezing it lightly. "You don't have to understand it right now. Just know you're not alone anymore." That evening, when the sky outside the window turned orange and the sounds of traffic dulled into background hum, she reached for his hand on her own. No words, no dramatic declaration, just her fingers sliding into his in quiet thanks. And in that simple gesture, something delicate bloomed inside her, a seed of hope, planted not by grand gestures but by steady presence. In his arms, even when he only held her hand, she felt anchored again, like she wasn't floating through grief anymore, but slowly, carefully, returning to life. He didn't try to fix her. He simply stayed, and that, more than anything, began to heal the places inside her that she thought would never feel warmth again. The final day in the hospital passed like the soft ending of a song you didn't realize you were humming along to until it faded into silence. And as the morning sun filtered through the wide glass window, Senorita sat upright for the first time with a strength that didn't tremble anymore. Her fingertips touched the hem of her cardigan while her eyes wandered toward the man helping her gather her things. Judge John, no longer just a distant figure in a courtroom or a buried memory from college, but now someone who had become her shelter through the storm. He smiled as he folded her shawl and carefully placed it inside the new overnight bag he'd bought her, one she hadn't even noticed arrive because he never made a show of kindness. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but holding a strange tenderness that made her pulse feel like a melody. She nodded, still a little nervous, unsure of what the world beyond the hospital room would feel like again. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the warmth of the morning sun on her face, and beside her was a man who wasn't rushing her, only waiting with quiet patience and the silent promise of safety. The car that pulled up was sleek but not ostentatious, the driver greeting John with respect and Senorita with gentleness. And as the doors closed behind them and the city slowly drifted past, outside the windows, John turned to her and said, "You need a place where the air feels kind and the walls don't remind you of pain. Let me take you somewhere that feels like peace." She didn't ask where he was taking her. She didn't need to. Her trust had begun to bloom quietly over the past days, like soft petals turning toward light, and now she leaned against the window watching the skyline change, buildings fading into green hills, noise melting into birdsong. The ride grew quieter as the road curved gently upward, climbing the winding hill that cradled a secluded mansion far from the city's pulse. The gates opened slowly, silently, revealing a wide cobblestone driveway lined with delicate hanging lanterns and climbing roses that kissed the edges of marble walls. When the car stopped and the door opened, Senorita stepped out into a scene that felt like something out of a forgotten dream. John's home was not just beautiful, it was breathtaking. Towering columns stood like sentinels beside a vast entryway framed by stained glass doors, and as she walked forward, her heels clicked softly against cream-colored marble that shimmered like starlight beneath her feet. Inside, the air smelled of soft lilies and orange blossoms, floral and fresh, like spring lived permanently within the walls. Skylights opened the ceiling to blue heavens above, and glass balconies curved along the upper levels like translucent lace. "This is your home now," John said, watching her eyes widen as she slowly turned in place, taking in the sweeping staircases, the gleaming bookshelves, and the way light seemed to dance naturally in every corner of the space. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words formed, only a trembling breath of wonder and disbelief. He led her gently through each space, not to impress her, but to make her feel welcome. The sitting room with velvet couches and walls the color of late dusk, the reading nook with bay windows and a hammock-like swing, the music room with an antique piano untouched but waiting for laughter, the kitchen, wide and warm, with wooden shelves and copper pans that glowed with the memory of family meals. And finally, through a long hallway lined with paintings of wild landscapes and oceans, he opened two French doors that led to a garden she hadn't expected. It wasn't large, but it was magic. A courtyard nestled in the hill's embrace, where white and lavender tulips bloomed in silent poetry across manicured beds. A small stone fountain singing quietly at the center. "I remember in college you said tulips made you feel like the world was kind again," John said, stepping beside her, watching her reach out to touch the soft petals with reverence. "So I named this garden after you." She turned to look at him, but he didn't boast. He simply smiled, humble, content with her surprise. Something inside her chest warmed beyond words, as if her soul had sighed in relief for the first time in years. The days that followed passed not with haste, but with stillness, a kind of deliberate living where moments stretched like golden thread. In the mornings, she would wake up in the sunroom guest suite he'd prepared for her, sunlight soaking her face while birds chirped softly on the nearby trees. John would already be in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, attempting to cook breakfast with varying degrees of success. She would laugh when he flipped a pancake too soon or burned the toast slightly, and he'd pretend to pout just to hear her laugh again. They cooked together, often making a mess, flour in her hair, melted butter on his shirt, and laughter echoing between them like music more healing than any song. Afternoons were spent in the garden, tending to the tulips or reading side by side, sometimes without speaking for hours, just enjoying the presence of someone who didn't demand anything of her except honesty. And in the evenings, as the world cooled and the wind began to hum through the trees, they'd curl up in the den beside the stone fireplace, her feet tucked beneath a soft blanket, while he read aloud from classic books or told her about courtroom cases that had left him questioning justice. But it was on the fifth night, when rain whispered against the glass and thunder rolled far away like a tired sigh, that something changed. Something neither of them named, but both of them felt. The lights inside the house glowed softly, warm like candlelight, and the French doors to the upper balcony stood open, letting the wind carry the scent of rain-drenched earth. Señorita stood there barefoot, wearing one of the cotton robes John had laid out for her hair slightly damp from the light drizzle, and her eyes looking up into the dark sky like it was painting secrets with water. John stepped onto the balcony behind her, his shirt sleeves rolled and collar loose, and for a moment he just watched her. There was a kind of peace in her stillness that made his chest ache. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, not as a question but an invitation. She turned to him, surprised, and for a moment hesitated. But then she smiled, the first real full smile he'd seen since she came into his life, and she placed her hand into his. They danced slowly, barefoot on rain-slicked marble, the thunder fading into the distance, and the music of raindrops composing their rhythm. His hand rested gently on the small of her back, hers curled against his chest, their steps unchoreographed but perfect in their simplicity. She tilted her head back and laughed as a raindrop kissed her nose, and he watched her in wonder. Her joy, her softness, her rebirth unfolding right there in his arms. He didn't speak. He didn't try to claim the moment with declarations. He simply held her close, cherished the feel of her heartbeat near his, and allowed the silence to carry everything he couldn't say yet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and in that space between heartbeat and breath, something sacred passed between them. Not love fully formed, but the raw, delicate beginning of something rare and true. And in that rain, love began to bloom, not loudly, not with fire, but like a seed breaking soil for the first time after a long, cold winter. Quiet, steady, and unstoppable. The rain had dried by morning, but the scent of it lingered in the garden, clinging to tulip petals like nature's afterthought, and inside the mansion, silence reigned, a peaceful, golden hush that wrapped around Señorita as she stood barefoot by the kitchen window, staring out into the dew-covered landscape with a hand resting on her stomach. Something had shifted, not just between them, but within her. She'd felt it days ago, subtle tremors beneath her skin, faint waves of dizziness that washed over her in the mornings, soft flutters in her chest when she moved too quickly or breathed too deeply. At first, she brushed them off as exhaustion, maybe the weight of healing, maybe the emotional whirlwind she'd just come through. But then came the afternoon when she tried to make coffee and had to rush to the sink, her stomach turning violently, her head light, and her breath catching in a way that wasn't panic, but something else. And that night, when the smell of lavender from the garden made her queasy instead of calm, she sat alone on the edge of the bed in her sunlit guest room and stared at the floor for a long time, heart pounding with a thought she didn't dare voice yet. The next morning, while John was upstairs organizing a meeting call he had reluctantly agreed to take, she slipped into town with her coat wrapped tightly, hair pulled into a low bun, sunglasses hiding eyes filled with doubt and fragile hope. She didn't tell him where she was going. She wasn't ready to speak it aloud. At the pharmacy, her hands shook as she paid for the test, her fingers cold, even though the sun was high. And back at the mansion, she locked herself in the en-suite bathroom, her breath shallow as she waited for the result, every second dragging like a lifetime. She sat on the tiled floor with her back against the wall, the test lying face down on the edge of the tub, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might bruise her ribs. She closed her eyes, whispered prayers she hadn't dared form in years, and finally reached out with trembling fingers. She turned it over. 2 lines. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, leaned forward, stared again. 2 lines, clear, undeniable, beautiful. Her mouth parted, no words coming out, just a stunned gasp, and then a choked sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, and she stood slowly, still gripping the plastic test like it was a sacred relic, and stared at herself. Wide eyes, flushed cheeks, lips trembling. "I thought I couldn't," she whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. "They said I couldn't." Her hands pressed to her belly, instinctive, protective, in awe. And then the tears came, hot, silent, unstoppable. Not from pain, not from fear, but from a happiness so unfamiliar it made her legs weak. She sank back onto the bed, curling around the secret that had just become her entire world, her smile shaky but real. She didn't know how long she stayed there, only that eventually she heard footsteps in the hallway and his voice calling her name gently, unaware of the storm of joy waiting just beyond the door. When she stepped out, he turned toward her, already smiling, but the smile faltered when he saw her eyes, her flushed face, the test cradled in her palms like a whisper of the impossible. He blinked, confused, his brow furrowing, and then, without her needing to say a word, he froze. His eyes dropped to the test, back to her eyes, and for a moment, time froze. "Is that?" he asked, voice barely audible. She nodded once, her lips trembling, her eyes flooded with new tears. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like magic, and for a second neither moved. Then suddenly he stepped forward, took the test from her gently, stared at it as if it were a miracle carved into glass, and his breath came out in a stuttered gasp. "You're pregnant?" he repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. And then he dropped to his knees, so fast and full of emotion it made her gasp, and he wrapped his arms around her waist, buried his face into the soft fabric of her robe, and let out a broken sound that held disbelief, reverence, and overwhelming joy. "You're pregnant," he whispered again, over and over, as if each time he said it, he was rewriting the entire story she'd been told. His hands slid to her belly, cradling it gently, as if he could already feel the life growing inside. "You were never the problem," he said through tears, his voice breaking. "You are a miracle. You always were." She sank to the floor with him, their arms tangled, their hearts thundering together, her forehead pressed to his as they wept, laughed, and held each other like the world had just spun into alignment. That night, the sky was clear, the stars bold and endless, and they sat on the soft lounge chairs of the garden patio, wrapped in a thick blanket, her back nestled against his chest, his hands resting gently over her belly, as if promising to protect everything it held. They didn't need music. The silence of the earth, the occasional chirp of a cricket, and the slow rhythm of their breathing was enough. He kissed the side of her neck, a soft press of lips that held more devotion than any vow, and whispered into her hair, "I don't know what I did to deserve this moment, but I swear I'll spend every day honoring it." She tilted her head, resting her cheek against his, and they stared up at the stars, no longer wondering if they were meant for other people, no longer doubting if they could have a future. That night, as her fingers curled over his, and his thumb slowly traced circles on the slight curve of her stomach, they began to speak softly of the days to come, the names they liked, the way the nursery might look, the dreams they thought they had buried. There was no rush in their voices, no fear, just wonder, just hope. And in the garden that once bloomed with tulips, now bloomed something even rarer. A future that once seemed impossible, quietly unfolding beneath their hands, heartbeat by heartbeat. Morning light had never felt this meaningful, golden rays slipping through the lace curtains of the master suite as Señorita stood before the full-length mirror, smoothing down the soft blue dress that cradled her slight, delicate bump. It was still small, barely noticeable to a stranger's eye, but to her, every subtle curve was a miracle, every change a quiet testament to the life growing inside her. She ran her hands gently over the fabric, fingers pausing over the place where a heartbeat now echoed, and smiled. A quiet, unshakable smile that came from deep within, a joy that months ago she thought she'd never feel again. Behind her, John adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his reflection meeting hers in the mirror as he approached slowly, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. "Ready for our first little adventure?" he whispered, his voice low, affectionate, full of awe. She nodded, and he kissed her temple before gently taking her hand, leading her down the hall, past the blooming tulip garden that now felt like part of their very soul, and into the waiting car that would take them to the clinic. The drive was quiet, but not in the empty way, quiet in the contentment kind of way, where smiles are exchanged without words, fingers intertwine effortlessly, and time doesn't feel rushed. When they arrived, the staff greeted them kindly, and though a few heads turned when John, Renowned judge, calm and always composed, walked in holding his partner's hand like she was royalty. Neither of them noticed. All they could think about was that heartbeat they were about to see again. Inside the examination room, everything felt like a dream. The doctor, warm-eyed and kind, smiled as she applied the gel on Senorita's belly, then guided the ultrasound wand with gentle precision. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, tiny, rhythmic, miraculous. The baby's heartbeat echoed through the room like a quiet symphony, fast and strong, fluttering like a promise of forever. John squeezed her hand tighter, his eyes glistening as he leaned closer, whispering in disbelief, "That's our baby." His voice cracked just slightly, not from fear, but from reverence, and Senorita turned her head toward him, seeing him, this strong, commanding man, completely undone by the sight of new life. Her heart swelled. They laughed softly, wiped tears discreetly, and spoke in hushed tones with the doctor about vitamins, growth, the next scan. All of it felt surreal, wrapped in a kind of happiness that was still new, but deeply real. After the appointment, John insisted on helping her sit up, fixing the hem of her dress with unnecessary care, placing her shoes on like she was made of moonlight and porcelain, and when they exited the room, arms still linked, the last thing they expected was a ghost from a past that neither of them wanted back. But there he stood, Rachel, frozen in place near the waiting room, holding a file in one hand, his jaw slack, eyes locked on the unmistakable sight of Senorita's gently rounding belly. For a moment, no one spoke. Time collapsed into silence, thick and tense. Senorita saw him before John did, and in that second her entire body went still, not from fear, not anymore, but from a rage so clean it shimmered beneath her skin like ice on fire. Rachel took a step forward, confusion tangled in his features, voice weak but loud enough to break the hush. "You're pregnant." His disbelief sounded like an accusation, like her body had betrayed his cruel verdict. Senorita turned, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, her gaze locking with his. Her voice, when it came, was low but cutting, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Turns out love was the cure," she said, her tone cold and graceful, her eyes sharp as glass. "What you broke, he healed." Rachel's face flushed red with 1,000 unspoken regrets, his lips parting to form an excuse, a defense, a plea. But he got none of it out, because John stepped forward, and the entire room felt it, the shift in energy, the silent storm in his eyes as he positioned himself in front of Senorita like a living shield. His jaw was tight, his stance firm, and his voice low and dangerous when he spoke. "Don't even think about coming near her," he said, his words calm but laced with steel. "If you speak to her, if you even look at her again the wrong way, I will have you jailed. I don't care who you were to her." Rachel blinked, stunned, his bravado folding under the intensity of John's presence. "She is not yours," John continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "She never was. And now, she's mine. We're getting married soon. You lost her the moment you chose cruelty over care." And then, softer, turning his face slightly to Senorita, as if to remind her she was no longer alone, he added, "She belongs where love lives now." Rachel stood there, shattered in a silence of his own making, his pride bleeding through his tightened fists, his mouth twitching with words he could never take back, watching the woman he'd once destroyed now bloom in front of him like a garden he was never meant to enter again. John gently took Senorita's hand, turned her away from the frozen figure, and together they walked out of the clinic, not rushing, not looking back. Outside, the air was bright with early autumn, leaves spinning in little dances along the pavement, and the sun shimmered softly over the curve of her dress. Senorita exhaled, a long, slow breath, then let out a quiet laugh, a release, a reclaiming. I didn't think I needed to see him again, she murmured, but I'm glad I did. John looked at her with admiration, pride, and a quiet kind of awe. You were flawless, he said. You didn't just face him. You reminded him what he lost. She smiled, rested a hand over her belly, and replied, He destroyed me once, but this little soul inside me, it rebuilt everything. He kissed her hand softly, then guided her back toward the car, his arm protective around her shoulders, his touch steady and warm. The road back home felt like a slow victory parade, quiet but filled with glory. And in the rearview mirror of that day, Rachel remained, a silent man watching the life he tried to destroy, now walking away from him, radiant, untouchable, and finally completely free. The sky blushed pink with the soft promise of evening as the estate atop the rolling hills glowed like a castle lifted from dreams. Strands of gold lights weaved through the branches of willow trees, casting warm reflections onto white rose petals that gently fluttered from hidden canopies above, falling like blessings over the courtyard. Lanterns hung low in glass globes, their flickering flames mirroring the stars that would soon claim the sky, and every corner of the grand lawn shimmered with the hushed elegance of something sacred. Senorita stood behind the velvet curtains that concealed her from the hundreds of guests seated beyond the aisle, her hands resting gently on her round belly, her breath a steady rhythm of calm she hadn't known in years. She wore a gown that whispered royalty, layers of soft champagne lace that kissed the grass behind her, the bodice hugging her with floral embroidery that shimmered in candlelight, and a delicate veil trailing like stardust behind her. Her long, silky hair flowed over her shoulders in soft waves, adorned only by tiny crystal pins that glimmered like a constellation designed just for her. In the mirror behind her, she caught the reflection of a woman she barely recognized, not the one who was left crying in a courtroom, not the one who collapsed under the weight of cruelty, but the woman who had risen, rebuilt, and bloomed. The soft knock on the door came gently, followed by the coordinator's voice. It's time. Outside, the music began, soft strings, delicate and slow, and the guests turned as she stepped through the arch, her figure framed in the golden light like a vision born from hope itself. Every breath held still, every whisper paused as the crowd rose to their feet in awe. Some had seen her broken. Some had heard of the divorce, the hospital, the man who tried to erase her light, but today they witnessed her rise. Her bump was visible beneath her gown, not hidden, but honored, the gentle swell of life moving with each graceful step she took. Gasps of admiration echoed down the aisle. She was radiant, untouchable, divine. And at the end of that aisle stood John, dressed in a tailored navy suit that deepened the blue of his eyes, his hands clasped tightly as he struggled to breathe through the emotion swelling in his chest. The moment he saw her, he broke. Tears slipped quietly down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He let the world see his devotion. Her steps grew slower as she neared him, not from hesitation but from savoring. Every moment, every heartbeat, every inch closer to the man who had redefined love for her. When she finally reached him, he took her hands with trembling fingers, lifted them to his lips and whispered so only she could hear, "You were always meant to be mine." The officiant spoke, but the crowd barely heard. The real ceremony unfolded between the two hearts, locked in that intimate gaze. Their vows were not just promises, but poetry wrapped in healing. John spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not my second chance. You are my only chance, the one I prayed for before I knew how to pray. I vow to never let you doubt your worth, your power, your beauty again. I vow to raise this child beside you with laughter, with truth, and with love deeper than time." Senorita's voice was soft but unwavering, her eyes never leaving his. You didn't just heal me. You reminded me I could feel again. You made the broken parts of me sacred. I vow to love you in your strength and your silence. I vow to never take this miracle for granted. Our child, our love, this life we built from ash. Rings were exchanged with trembling hands. A single violin played as they kissed, for the first time as husband and wife. And in that kiss was everything: grief overcome, joy rediscovered, futures rewritten. The applause erupted as rose petals cascaded again from the heavens, the night sky welcoming their union, like the stars themselves were clapping. The reception followed beneath a grand white marquee stretched across the lawn, with tables dressed in ivory silk, golden cutlery, and floral centerpieces that spilled like waterfalls of peonies and tulips. Her favorite, of course. Candlelight flickered from every surface, and soft music mingled with laughter and clinking glasses. Guests toasted with champagne and sparkling apple juice for the bride, their words echoing with themes of strength, rebirth, and the miracle of love when given a second chance. The air was thick with affection, strangers hugged like family, and old wounds melted in the warmth of a story that had come full circle. The first dance was not choreographed, but it didn't need to be. John held her as if holding something divine, her bare feet stepping gently on the grass, her laughter filling the space like wind chimes. Her bump pressed against him as he spun her gently, his hand always supportive, always knowing exactly where she needed him most. Photographers captured it all, the way her eyes closed as she rested her head on his chest, the way he whispered something into her ear that made her glow with joy, the way their fingers linked as if they were made to fit only each other. Later, beneath the open sky, as the music played low and the final dance gave way to evening stillness, Senorita stood barefoot on the grass, her hands resting on her belly, her face turned up toward the glittering stars above. John approached quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on top of hers. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "The life we created? The love we almost never found?" He nodded, kissing the edge of her jaw, his voice low. "You gave me life again." She turned in his arms, tears glimmering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming gratitude of it all. And when the fireworks lit the sky moments later, brilliant bursts of crimson and silver and sapphire, it wasn't just a celebration of a wedding. It was the closing of an old chapter, the burning away of every word spoken to wound, every night cried in silence, every lie believed about her worth. The sky itself bowed to their joy. As the crowd watched in awe, John and Senorita stood in the center of the lawn, wrapped in each other, lips locked in a kiss that was deep, slow, and full of everything they had survived. The guests erupted in applause, but to the two of them there was no one else. Just this kiss, just this love, just this forever. And beneath that sky, with a child growing inside her, and a man who would never let her fall again, Senorita finally felt what she had never truly known before. Not just love, but being loved back, completely and completely seen. The night air still shimmered with the final traces of fireworks as John guided her gently back toward the awaiting car, the echoes of cheers fading behind them, while her fingers remained entwined with his like ivy around oak, both firm and tender. The drive to their private honeymoon suite was silent in the most sacred way, every glance between them carrying a language only they understood now, every heartbeat echoing with the promises they had spoken under vows and stars. The suite, nestled in the hills above the vineyard where they once shared their first walk together, opened into a warm, glowing haven, a room lit not by chandeliers, but by the soft flicker of hundreds of candles carefully placed across the room, their flames dancing against walls lined with silk drapes in cream and blush. The air was sweet with notes of lavender and amber, and a gentle instrumental melody played from the hidden speakers. something soft and slow that wrapped around their bodies like invisible silk. Senorita stood in awe at the threshold, her bare feet stepping lightly onto the velvet carpet as John paused behind her, watching her breathe in the beauty of the space, the scent of roses, the moonlight spilling across the four-poster bed covered in ivory sheets and rose petals that seemed to glow under candlelight. Without speaking, he lifted her into his arms, the train of her gown flowing like liquid gold behind them, and he carried her toward the bed, his voice a low murmur of love that trembled as he whispered, "Tonight, I want to love every part of you, slowly, deeply, truly." Her heart thundered in her chest, not from fear, but from a kind of intimacy that stripped her bare long before the dress ever left her skin. He didn't rush. His fingers moved with reverence, slowly unfastening the delicate clasps at the back of her gown, each movement laced with gratitude, as if each inch of her revealed was a gift he'd waited his whole life to unwrap. The gown slid down her shoulders like a sigh, pooling at her feet, leaving her in soft lace, her brown, smooth skin glowing under the candlelight, her curves full and goddess-like, her bump a sacred curve that he stared at with awe before kneeling before her, kissing just above it, whispering something only the baby could hear. Her breath caught and her eyes shimmered, not with insecurity or hesitation, but with a love so full it ached in the most beautiful way. He stood and cupped her face, thumbs brushing her cheeks, eyes locked with hers. He didn't look at her like she was a body to be claimed, but a soul to be honored. Slowly, she reached up and unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers grazing the skin of his chest, feeling his heartbeat hammer against her palm, steady and strong, a rhythm that promised her safety, desire, devotion. When they finally lay together, skin to skin, wrapped in the softness of the sheets and the warmth of each other, it was not a collision. It was a communion. John touched her with the care of a man sculpting a masterpiece, tracing every inch of her body with his lips, his hands, his breath. He didn't avoid her scars, he kissed them. The ones on her abdomen from past surgeries, the faint ones on her back from stress and life and pain. He memorized them, turned them into altars. She cried then, not because it hurt, but because for the first time in her life, her body was being touched without demand, without judgment, only love. Her tears fell quietly, but he caught them, kissing each one away, whispering between them, "You're perfect, you're safe. You're everything." Their bodies moved together in a rhythm that felt ancient and eternal, slow and poetic, filled with sweet laughter between kisses, playful gasps, moments where they stopped just to breathe each other in, as if afraid this night might disappear like a dream. He whispered her name like a prayer, and she whispered his like a song, their mouths meeting again and again in kisses that weren't about passion, but presence. And when they reached that sacred moment, when bodies trembled and time blurred, it wasn't about release, but arrival. They held each other tightly, breath mingling, hands grasping, legs tangled, hearts crashing into a stillness that felt like forever. The candlelight flickered beside them, casting shadows of two lovers who had once stood in ruins and now lay rebuilt in the most divine way. He wrapped her in his arms after, pulling the sheet gently over her shoulder, pressing soft kisses to her forehead, her shoulder, her belly. She curled into his chest, her fingers drawing circles over his heart, her breathing softening into sleep, but not before whispering against his skin, "You gave me life again." And he held her tighter, resting his cheek against her hair, whispering back, "You are my whole life now." They didn't sleep for hours, not because they were restless, but because letting go of each other felt impossible. They lay in silence, sometimes speaking in hushed tones about baby names, about traveling the world, about painting a nursery in warm yellows and grays, about how much they never imagined love could be this gentle. When they finally did drift into sleep, it was wrapped in the warmth of moonlight and candle scent, in sheets damp with love and arms that promised to never let go. The room was quiet, the music fading into the background, and outside the wind whispered through the trees like the earth itself was sighing in contentment. It wasn't just a night of physical closeness. It was the stitching together of two souls who had once lived lifetimes apart. And as Senorita slipped into dreams, her hand resting over his, both curved protectively over her belly, a smile tugged at her lips. Because now she didn't just have love. She had a home, in him, in their future, in the life they had created. And in that soft silence of shared breath and tangled hearts, she knew without question, this night was not just the beginning of marriage, it was the beginning of forever. While Senorita slept wrapped in warm candlelight in John's arms, her skin still humming with the tenderness of their wedding night and the growing heartbeat inside her, far across the city in a dim apartment lit only by the dull glow of a laptop screen, Rachel sat frozen at his desk, his jaw clenched and breath caught somewhere between disbelief and suffocation. He hadn't meant to search for her, at least that's what he told himself. But curiosity was a slow poison, and the moment he saw her name trending, his hands moved before he could stop them. The screen glared with photos from the wedding, captured moments of a fairy tale he never thought she'd live. There she was, walking down an aisle flooded in gold light, her brown skin glowing like bronze kissed by firelight, her smile as wide and graceful as the sky itself. The lace gown curved around her pregnant belly like it was meant for royalty, her head tilted gently toward the man beside her, not him, but another, one who looked at her like she was air after drowning. John. His name was under every post, every caption. Judge John, the man who held her hand at the altar, who whispered vows into her ear like poetry, who kissed her beneath fireworks while the world applauded. And Rachel, he could only watch. His cursor hovered over the image, his eyes bloodshot, his throat burning as if the very sight of her happiness was acid he couldn't swallow. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the edges of the table, like the wood might steady the guilt crashing through him. The memories of his own smug laughter the day he signed the divorce papers, echoing in the silence like thunder laced with shame. He had laughed. Actually, laughed. When she handed over those papers with trembling hands, her eyes swollen from tears she refused to shed in front of him. He remembered the sharp cruelty in his voice, the way he spat those words. "You're infertile. I want a divorce." He didn't even flinch. He had walked out that day thinking he'd won something, thinking he'd freed himself from weakness, from failure. But now every breath was heavy with the weight of what he threw away. That woman, his wife once, was now a queen. Not because of fame or money, but because she had risen from the ashes he buried her in. She had found love where he had given none, found life where he offered only emptiness, found herself in the very ruins he left behind. And she looked radiant, more alive, more breathtaking than she ever did in the years he spent ignoring her, blaming her, erasing her piece by piece. The internet was flooded with images, her baby shower announcement, her twirling barefoot in the garden with her dress billowing around her, John kissing her stomach with tears in his eyes as guests clapped around them. It was unbearable. He slammed the laptop shut like it might stop the ache crawling through his chest, but the silence only made it worse. The guilt came in waves, sharp, brutal, relentless. He couldn't sleep. Every night he sat up thinking about her, how she used to beg for his attention, how she cooked his meals, folded his shirts, smiled when he never smiled back. And now she was someone else's world, someone else's forever. And all he had left were ghosts. Desperate, Rachel pulled out his old phone, the one she had once texted him from during lonely nights when he never replied. He scrolled through the messages, her words staring back at him like echoes from another life. "I love you. I want to try again." Please, let's talk. He hadn't replied to any of them. He had mocked them, deleted most, but now he read them as if they held oxygen. And when the panic became too much to bear, he tried calling. First once, then again, then 10 times. No answer. The line didn't even ring. It was blocked. He opened his messaging app, fingers trembling, typing out words he never thought he'd say. I'm sorry. Please talk to me. I didn't mean it. You look happy, but I miss you. But when he hit send, it all bounced back. Message failed. He tried social media, blocked there too. In a last pathetic act of longing, he drove to her old apartment complex, parked outside like a man searching for a ghost, only to be met with a cold truth from the doorman. She moved out months ago, married now. They bought a home on the hills. Rachel leaned against his steering wheel, the weight of his stupidity collapsing over him like a landslide. He had called her infertile, his voice ringing in his own ears like poison. And now she was pregnant, glowing, cherished. His words had once crushed her. But she had rebuilt herself into a cathedral he could never enter again. Everywhere he turned, she was unreachable. She had outgrown him in every way. Her eyes in those wedding pictures held no trace of the pain he caused, only power. Her body, once neglected by his coldness, was now held and adored, her laughter unchained, her light fully awake. And worst of all, she never looked back. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to rewrite the timeline, but regret doesn't offer second chances. It only shows you the ending to a story you should have written better. He poured a glass of whiskey, sat in the dark, and stared at the framed photo from their wedding years ago, back when her smile was soft and unsure, back when he thought he could do better. Now she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and she was someone else's miracle. That night, as the city slept and her home, miles away, was filled with lullabies of baby dreams and gentle kisses, Rachel remained alone in the dim silence of his regrets. His heart beat hollow, his hands empty. He hadn't just lost her, he had erased himself from the only chapter that ever mattered. And now all he could do was watch her rise, from behind a glass screen, from a distance too wide to cross, from a story that would never again have room for his name. As the night grew heavier around Rachel's empty apartment, and his regrets folded into the silence like smoke without flame, somewhere far from that sorrow, in a mansion perched beneath the morning sun, the soft cry of new life echoed through polished halls lined with jasmine and lullabies. Senorita had given birth. The once heartbroken woman who was cast away like dust now lay wrapped in soft linen, a sheen of sweat on her brow, her hair tousled, her cheeks glowing with the warmth of motherhood, her fingers wrapped tightly around the tiny hand of the baby boy nestled against her chest. Her breathing was slow, peaceful, full of a power only mothers know, and beside her stood John, his eyes red from tears he no longer held back, his hands trembling as he cradled the infant, swaddled in a dove-gray blanket embroidered with gold thread. "Welcome to the world, my little king," he whispered with a voice so tender it trembled at the edge of breaking. His lips brushed the baby's forehead, and for the first time in his life he wept freely, not from loss, but from a joy so sacred it humbled him. They named him Justice, not for grandeur, but for the journey, the pain Senorita endured, the betrayal she overcame, the love she rebuilt from brokenness, and the strength she carried when no one believed in her. Justice was more than a name. He was the answer to every silent prayer, every night Senorita cried alone, every insult she endured, and every time she had to rise when the world tried to silence her. The room filled with soft sunlight as nurses moved around gently, placing flowers in vases, humming lullabies, and preparing warm tea with honey and herbs. Senorita sat up slowly, the soft weight of her baby in her arms, her fingers stroking the curve of his cheek as if memorizing each detail. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now shimmered with fulfillment so deep it was hard to look away. John kissed her temple, then sat beside her on the bed, his arm sliding around her shoulder, pulling her into the crook of his chest. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought him into this world, our world." And she looked up at him with tears of her own, the kind that came not from sadness but from a soul finally breathing freely. "We did it," she replied, her voice soft, tired, but brimming with pride. Outside the window, the garden John had named after her was in full bloom, tulips and peonies swaying in a gentle breeze, the same garden where she once danced barefoot in the rain, and now where a cradle of love rocked with new life inside. Their lives had been rewritten, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet victories of shared mornings, in the smell of fresh coffee and baby lotion, in the rhythm of a home filled with laughter, bottles, lullabies, and unspoken understanding. Every night ended with kisses and gentle touches. Every morning began with her son's tiny hands reaching for hers, and John's protective arms already wrapped around them both. There were no more tears of doubt, no more painful flashbacks, no more echoes of a voice that once tried to define her worth. Rachel became nothing more than a chapter in an old book she no longer needed to read. His name held no place in their home, no room in her memory, no corner in her heart. He had faded like a storm that came and went, leaving her sky clearer than ever before. Now her world was filled with lullaby nights, diapered giggles, sleepy kisses on her collarbone, and the way John never left her side, whether she was exhausted or radiant, tearful or laughing. He loved her in every state, every hour, every season. He changed diapers in silk robes, rocked their son to sleep in the early hours, and often whispered to Justice while Senorita pretended to sleep, "You know your mama saved me too, right?" Their son grew in a home full of softness and strength, where his mother ruled with grace and his father loved with fierce devotion. Every photograph on their mantel told a story not of perfection, but of redemption, of rising again. The old scars on Senorita's body remained, but they were no longer marks of pain. They were proof of survival, symbols of the bridge she had walked across alone before finding someone waiting for her at the end, arms open, ready to build something eternal. As justice grew, so did their joy. Milestones became celebrations. His first laugh, his first step, the first time he called her Mama, and reached for her with chubby hands that didn't just grasp fingers, but souls. John painted a nursery with stars on the ceiling, spent nights telling him stories of courage and kindness, and every Sunday morning they laid as a family on the living room rug, a tangle of love and warmth and baby giggles that made time itself slow down. Friends visited often, bringing flowers, blessings, and awe at how far she had come. "You're glowing," they'd say. And she was, not just from pregnancy or motherhood, but from peace, from being loved in all the ways she once believed she'd never experience. Her smile was no longer guarded, it was soft, wide, radiant. The woman who once signed divorce papers with trembling hands now held a marriage license framed on the wall with the words, "Forever found me anyway." Her wedding ring sparkled beneath the morning sun as she sipped tea on the patio, her baby asleep on her chest, John's hand resting on her knee. There was no grandeur to this happiness, just truth, just quiet, consistent, unconditional love. And perhaps the most poetic justice of all was not that Rachel had to watch from a distance, but that she no longer cared if he did. His existence no longer registered, his silence no longer haunted, his cruelty no longer echoed. Because in the end she had not only healed, she had created a new world, a new rhythm, a new name. Senorita was no longer a woman pleading to be loved. She was a wife, a mother, a queen in her own right, ruling a kingdom built on tenderness. Her love story wasn't one of revenge or bitterness, it was one of rebirth, of finding joy after devastation, of being seen after invisibility. She had walked through the fire, and now she danced through the light, and in that golden mansion, beneath soft music and the scent of roses and newborn warmth, she held her baby in one arm, her husband's hand in the other, and looked at her reflection in the glass, no longer asking if she was enough, because now she knew. She had always been more than enough. She had simply been waiting for the world and love to catch up.